In the late 1930s, American foreign policy in the Pacific hinged on support for China, and aggression against China by Japan, therefore, necessarily would bring Japan into conflict with the United States. As early as 1931, the Tokyo government had extended its control over the Chinese province of Manchuria. And the following year the Japanese cemented their hold on the region with the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo. A clash at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing on July 7, 1937, signaled the beginning of open warfare between Japan and the United Front of Chinese Nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party. In response, the United States government extended its first loan to China in 1938. In July 1939, the U.S. announced the termination of the 1911 Treaty of Commerce and Navigation with Japan. Beginning in the summer of 1940, the U.S. began to restrict the export to Japan of materials useful in war. In July 1941, by which time the Japanese had occupied all of Indochina and had entered into an alliance with the Axis powers, the U.S. government severed all commercial and financial relations with Japan. Although Japan continued to negotiate with the United States up to the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, the government of Prime Minister Tojo Hideki decided on war. The order for the assault was issued on November 5, 1941, and on November 16 the task force began its rendezvous in the Kuril Islands. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi led a fleet including 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers to a point some 275 miles north of Hawaii. From there about 360 planes in total were launched. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had been stationed at Pearl Harbor since April 1940. In addition to nearly 100 naval vessels, including 8 battleships, there were substantial military and air forces. On October 16 and November 24 and 27, the commanders of Pearl Harbor warned for war. In response to these warnings, the measures taken by the Army and Navy commanders were far from adequate. Commanders ordered an alert against sabotage and concentrated most of their fighter planes at the base on Wheeler Field in an effort to prevent damage to them. In the 10 days between the war warning of November 27 and the Japanese attack itself, no additional action was taken by Washington. 4 hours before the decisive moment, a Japanese submarine was sighted by the minesweeper, USS Condor. About 2.5 hours later, the commander of the destroyer USS Sword sent a message saying that he had attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area near Pearl Harbor. While commanders waited for confirmation of this report, the Japanese opened hostilities. In these same morning hours, U.S. Army Private George Elliott, practicing on the radar set after its normal closing time, noticed a large flight of planes on the screen. When he telephoned his lieutenant, he was told to disregard the observation, as a flight of B-17 bombers from the United States was expected at that time.
Relax! This flight of B-17's coming in from the mainland.
Once again, an opportunity was missed. The first Japanese dive bomber appeared over Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. It was part of the first wave of nearly 200 aircraft. Within a quarter of an hour, the various airfields at the base were subjected to savage attacks. Many fighters were destroyed on the ground. In total, more than 180 aircraft were destroyed. Most of the damage to the battleships was inflicted in the first 30 minutes of the assault. Hardly a vessel escaped damage. The anti-aircraft crews on the various vessels were fairly prompt in getting into the action, and Army personnel fired with what they had, but the force of the attack was in no serious way blunted. The battleship USS Arizona blew up with a tremendous explosion. Riddled with bombs and torpedoes, the USS West Virginia settled on an even keel on the bottom of the harbor. The USS Oklahoma, hit by 4 torpedoes within 5 minutes, rolled completely over, with its bottom and propeller rising above the waters of the harbor. The USS California, the flagship of the Pacific Battle Force, was torpedoed and ordered abandoned as it slowly sank in shallow water. The target ship USS Utah also was sunk. Shortly after 9 a.m., the Japanese withdrew. No one could doubt that the Japanese had gained great success. In all, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor crippled or destroyed nearly 20 American ships and more than 300 airplanes. Dry docks and airfields were likewise destroyed. Most important, 2,403 sailors, soldiers, and civilians were killed and about 1,000 people were wounded. The Japanese lost from 29 to 60 planes, 5 midget submarines, perhaps 1 or 2 fleet submarines, and fewer than 100 men. The date which will live in infamy, as U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt termed it, unified the U.S. public, and swept away any earlier support for neutrality. On December 8, Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote.
It is obvious that planning the attack began many weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace.
The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American military forces. I regret to tell you that
Over 3,000,
American lives have been lost.
no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Because of this unprovoked, dastardly attack by Japan, I ask that the Congress declare a state of war.
Thank you for watching.
Is
Please
it
don't
true?
forget to subscribe to our channel.
Men are still trapped alive inside the Arizona.